confess I have kind of put off recording my review of Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama because I struggle to know how I would do this book justice. It is a very powerful read. It's not the easiest of reads, granted, but it is a very insightful book into the personal life of Barack Obama, in particular his upbringing, and it goes a long way to explaining why he champions the things he did in his presidency, but also kind of shaping the man he became. Now, as I said, it's taken a little while for me to document my thoughts, but I hope in today's video I can persuade you to pick up this book for yourself. Now, I appreciate the genre and the type of book and political figure that he has become is not everyone's cup of tea. It's not really mine either, if I'm perfectly honest. Picking up Dreams from My Father and also A Promised Land last year have been stretch goals for me. There are not very many figures like this that I would read books from, but Barack Obama is an exception as opposed to the rule. Sometimes it's worth pushing yourself out there because you find something just a little bit different that ticks all the right boxes. Let me get you a recap of the synopsis for Dreams from My Father, and then I can relay my thoughts to you. In this lyrical, unsentimental and compelling memoir, the son of black African father and a white American mother searches for a workable meaning to his life as a black American. It begins in New York, where Barack Obama learns that his father, a figure he knows more as myth than as a man, has been killed in a car accident. This sudden death inspires an emotional odyssey. First to a small town in Kansas, from which he retraces the migration of his mother's family to Hawaii, and then to Kenya, where he meets the African side of his family, confronts the bitter truth of his father's life, and at last reconciles his divided inheritance. Now, in terms of book length, Dreams from My Father isn't too long. We're looking at about 450 pages, or if you listen to the audio as I did, it's just a fraction over 14 hours. So in terms of size, nothing too onerous. The subject matter maybe makes it a little bit of a different story, if you like. It obviously talks about themes that maybe a little bit challenging, especially for some people. Not everyone wants to read something so heavy. However, I pushed myself out of my comfort zone to pick up this book and I don't regret it. So please, if you have this reservation for yourself, please just give it a go. Now, granted, biographies and memoirs also are not something I read very much of. However, when I do, I like to make them from kind of very prominent people I care about, and Barack Obama is one of those. Now, I don't love politics, I don't love politicians, but I would say Barack is an exception in that I agreed for what he stood for. And frankly, it's a shame he's already run his 2 terms because I think he was doing the right thing. I don't generally get invested with politics because it just feels like kids bickering and one does one thing, one undoes it as soon as they're out, and it's hard to invest emotionally in something that isn't stable, if you know what I mean. So I generally steer away from politics. This book does have its political leans, obviously, and again, not generally my cup of tea, but I didn't mind it in this book. Now, I picked this book up at the end of January and into the beginning of February because I hoped it would qualify for a Black Heritage award in the Goodreads 2026 Winter Challenge. Now, unfortunately, it didn't, but that doesn't mean I didn't get a lot out of this book. I listened to A Promised Land last year. Yes, it was last year. And again, this was an absolute stretch for me. I did not expect to enjoy it, and I really did. So I knew I wanted to pick up Dreams from My Father to really get an idea of who Barack was growing up and get an idea of the influences in his life to help shape the man he became. So let's get into what I really enjoyed about this audiobook. Now, as I've already kind of touched on briefly, the book covers topics that aren't particularly light. We're looking at race, racism, cultural differences, and also Barack growing up without a father figure. They are not the lightest of topics going, ever, but I knew this, obviously, going into the book, and I wanted this kind of grittier, candid, very honest read. It offers a lot of depth, both in terms of obviously Barack's life, but also Barack is very candid and very open and honest. He doesn't sugarcoat things, and that really shows throughout the book. Like, he doesn't try to explain himself, if you know what I mean. Like, he doesn't try to justify himself based on his history. This book is obviously about exploring that, but I didn't feel like at any point he was trying to use it to justify who he was, if you know what I mean. Where this book is also a little bit hard hitting in is that Barack is very open and honest about the fact that in the various towns he grows up in, he doesn't feel like he fits in anywhere. It wasn't particularly common in the time he was growing up for children to have mixed heritage. I suppose now, probably a lot more common than it was, but we're looking at, 50 years ago? I don't know how old you are, Barack, sorry. But obviously things were a bit different. There weren't very many kids like Barack, and so kids being kids, you know what they're like. You can more than imagine that he was not made to fit in, as much as a lot of this feeling came internally as well. You can be sure other kids were very quick to remind him as well, which is nasty, but that's kids, unfortunately. What I also really enjoyed about this audiobook is that it gave me knowledge about Barack's upbringing that I didn't know. For example, there is a period in Barack's childhood where he actually goes to live in Indonesia. This, I think, was after his mother married another man. They went and moved out to Indonesia, so he had a very different lifestyle between growing up in America and then going to Indonesia, which I didn't know or appreciate, that had even happened in his past. So I learned something new because of this book. Unfortunately, Barack's family life wasn't particularly what we would call stable, and although you would kind of attribute that to being a more modern phenomenon, like, it's interesting to see that even people of like our parents' age and beyond, that things weren't necessarily the kind of you marry one person, commit for life, and that's that sort of thing. Barack grew up in very different places with very different people. I think at one point he went to stay with his grandparents, like his mum's parents, I believe. So he had some very different kind of home and family dynamics throughout his childhood, which must have been quite jarring for him, and obviously having to refigure out his place in everything. We can only hope it gave him some of the resilience that he has come to develop throughout his adulthood, but it's the sort of thing you wouldn't wish on a child. So it was insightful to see that about him, and I do feel a bit sorry for him, because obviously nobody really wants instability for a child. But yeah, I learned something new from picking up this book. Something I talked about that I really enjoyed in The Promised Land is that the audiobook is narrated by Barack Obama himself. Now, I think if it were narrated by anybody else, I probably wouldn't gel with it. But because we are being told the author's story, and being narrated by the author, it makes the book feel all that more personal. Now, obviously, this book is personal in terms of its content, but also then being told by Barack Obama himself, it makes it feel like you're sat in the room with him. It makes the content far more engaging, certainly for me. I don't think it would have been right if somebody else had narrated this. I probably wouldn't have stuck with it. I suppose one of the things I took out of reading Dreams from My Father is that it doesn't necessarily matter what your background is. Yes, Barack had this kind of troubled childhood, and he spent a long time trying to learn about his father in the hopes that it would make him feel like he belonged somewhere, which is really kind of what I took away from this book. But it kind of goes to show that it doesn't matter if you don't. Having gone through everything that Barack did, he still had opportunities. He obviously was still able to become the president of the United States. So, although there are some disadvantages, I suppose, to things like this happening, like it doesn't have to define you. But even still, you can find hope in personal stories like these. As audiobook listens go, I actually listened to Dreams from My Father pretty quickly. Bearing in mind this was a 14-hour audio, I picked this up and listened to the audio in about a 2-week span. So that makes me average an hour a day or so, and certainly at the end, I know I binged about 3 hours to, kind of get to the end of the story and what Barack's kind of conclusions were as to his personal journey, if you like. So I really got on with this audio, clearly, and to have got through all of this story and learned what I have about Barack Obama and his background and his history, was really something I enjoyed picking up, even though it's out of my comfort zone. To summarise, Dreams from My Father is a really interesting and engaging book where we get to explore Barack's history and his heritage alongside himself as he tries to reconcile his mixed race heritage with a parental figure he didn't really know growing up. In fact, he only met his father once. Not only is Dreams from My Father interesting in terms of its content, it's more interesting to consider everything that's happened in scope of the man Barack Obama has become, what he stood for in his presidency, and understand really what made him who he is today. After listening to both The Promised Land and Dreams from My Father, I now want to listen to The Audacity of Hope. I believe it's the last kind of well-known book he has written. I'm hoping I can pick it up in audio format because this is really working for me. I kind of want to stick to that. And I think that could be a really interesting listen now knowing what I know from these other books. Whilst these are a little bit out of my comfort zone, I do believe it's worth stretching yourself now and then because you can find a hidden gem. And I would absolutely describe both Dreams from My Father and The Promised Land as one of those for me. Have you listened to or read Dreams from My Father or The Promised Land maybe? If you're interested to pick up either of these books, let me know and I can tell you a little bit more about it. I hope you've enjoyed today's pretty short review. I hope I've done the book justice. I hope I've convinced you to pick this up because it is a really enjoyable book to listen to or read, I'm sure, although the audio worked for me at the time. And I think everybody has something to learn from reading from this kind of perspective and really understanding what it was like to grow up in the likes of Barack Obama's shoes.